All right, hi everyone. We're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm sure more people will join. But first of all, welcome to PPAN's May webinar series, Do Mosquito Control Programs Make You Safer? We have Rella Abernathy from the City of Boulder with us today. And thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN. For those of you who aren't familiar with our webinar series, we try to hold one every month with a different speaker, so be sure to sign up for our e-news and check out our events calendar to keep up to date with our upcoming webinars. And we've really got a great presentation prepared for you today, but first we just wanted to tell you a little bit more about us. So we are People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN. We're hosting this webinar. We focus a lot on making Colorado a safe haven for all who live here, from people to pollinators. We do this through grassroots advocacy, education, and outreach, kind of like this webinar. We also do a lot of policy-focused community mobilization and habitat creation work. A good example of that would be our small grants program called the Habitat Fund, and that's based on the sales of our pollinator license plate. And those funds go towards creating a pollinator safe habitat while also promoting community mobilization. There really are a lot of reasons to do this type of work, but one of my favorite facts about pollinators is that they're actually super diverse. It's not just the bees and butterflies, but pollinators are also birds, bats, beetles, flies, wasps, and so much more. And in fact, this upcoming month in June will be designated as Colorado Pollinator Month, where our organization will be asking for extra support. And I can send a link in the chat about this. But anyways, on to the webinar. So today we are so happy to have Rella Abernathy, Ph.D. with us from the City of Boulder to speak. Rella is a senior ecologist for the Climate Initiatives Department Nature-Based Climate Solutions team at the City of Boulder. Her academic background is in insect physiology and plant and insect interactions. She worked at the EPA Region 10 pesticide program on pesticide alternatives and pesticide reduction policy with an interdisciplinary team who developed sustainable agricultural pilot projects with communities in Eastern Washington. Over the last 15 years, Rella managed the City of Boulder's integrated pest management program that is centered on ecosystems management approaches, and she also created a pesticide assessment process on an ecosystems management approach. And she created that pesticide assessment process that considers impacts to ecosystem function and stability. Rella's current role is developing programs and policies that build, that build and expand climate resilient landscapes in partnership with researchers, community members, NGOs, and others to equitably and inclusively implement nature-based climate solutions that conserve biodiversity and protect human health. Although we are talking about mosquito management today, this discussion can really be applied to the broader system of pest management. And why do we really care about pest or mosquito management when it comes to pollinators? Well, first of all, mosquitoes, while not major pollinators, do play a role in pollination, especially for certain plants like the bluntleaf orchid. Also, when we consider mosquito management, we need to consider its effects on pollinators and overall ecosystem health. And then finally, pest and mosquito management programs can impact human health and safety. So before we get started, and as a reminder, please stay muted, leave your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, time permitting. We also encourage you to make a donation today so that PPAN can continue to host this free webinar series. And these donations will directly support our education, advocacy, and habitat creation efforts this spring. And a donation of any size really does make a difference. So thank you for your consideration. And I can also put a link in the chat to make it easy for people. So thank you so much for joining, and I will pass it over to Rella.
Okay, so let me get my presentation up. For some reason, I can't see this. Okay. having trouble seeing the slide. Okay, here it is. All right. So thanks for the introduction, Anna Gray, and thanks to everyone for joining this webinar today about mosquito management. So as a senior ecologist with the nature-based climate solutions team for the City of Boulder, I'm focused on biodiversity and managing ecosystems in ways that promote ecological and community resilience. So I hope today that I can share some fun, new, and interesting facts about mosquitoes that you may not have heard before. And I also hope that I can make a case for how important it is that we learn all we can about the ecological systems that we manage using a systems-based approach. So this is probably the first thing that comes to mind at the mention of mosquitoes. And for many people, this is the only thing they know about mosquitoes. And the perception is strengthened by the media, and they tend to grab attention by showing photos or videos of people sticking their arm in a cage of mosquito that's actually used for lab trials. But this photo is a more accurate representation of how adult mosquitoes spend the majority of their lives feeding. Almost all mosquito species use nectar for their energy source, both males and females, and only female mosquitoes take a blood meal to get the nutrients and protein that they need to produce eggs. As we dig into mosquito control, let's take a few minutes before we start to learn about this fascinating group of insects, the mosquitoes. So the photos and facts that I'll share with you in the next few slides come from two great articles by mosquito biologists who study the beauty and diversity of ecological and the ecological importance of mosquitoes. This Smithsonian article is super fun and interesting and offers just a glimpse into the diversity of mosquitoes. And this is another short and interesting read in the conversation by Dan Peach, who's now on the faculty of the University of Georgia. And Dan does some really interesting work on mosquito behaviors and ecology. So if you aren't familiar with the incredible diversity of these little creatures and you love learning about nature, you're in for a treat. There are over 3,750 known species of mosquitoes and counting around the world. Yvonne Marie Linton, a mosquito biologist, is quoted here saying, "We have been grossly underestimating the diversity of mosquitoes. The number of new species that we find everywhere we go is phenomenal. Of the nearly 4,000 species of mosquitoes, just 100 around, that's only around 2.5% are known to vector diseases. But the few that do transmit disease have caused devastating amount of human illness and death. And of the 700,000 deaths from mosquito-borne illness each year, over half are from malaria, which is carried by the Anopheles mosquitoes. But of the 430 known Anopheles mosquitoes, only 30 to 40 are thought to transmit malaria. Of the 200 species here in the US, about 12 are known to transmit parasites or pathogens to people, and control efforts are focused mainly on West Nile virus. In Colorado, 57 species have been identified, and we regularly catch around a dozen or so species in our city traps. Of those, most of our focus is on the 3 species of Culex mosquitoes that can transmit West Nile virus. So mosquitoes have a long relationship with flowering plants, and mosquito diversity took off with the evolution of flowering plants. We don't know a whole lot about their role in pollination, mostly because it just hasn't been well studied. And there are examples of both generalist and specialist mosquito pollinators. An example of a specialist is a snow pool mosquito. And this is when Anna Gray was just mentioning the bluntleaf orchid blooms at the same time that the snow pool mosquito emerges. And when the mosquito takes a drink of nectar, its little head is just the right size to fit inside the orchid flower, where it picks up these little pollen balls called pollinia that stick to its head, and it then carries to the next orchid flower. Some mosquito species have evolved some pretty bizarre behaviors. Dan Peach studied a mosquito that feeds on honeydew, the sugary droplets excreted out of the back end of phloem-feeding insects. Some ants feed on aphid honeydew and milk them, kind of like dairy farmers, and the ants guard and protect the aphids from predators. Mosquitoes use odor cues to find flowers and hosts, including us. And apparently, this species can also track odors emitted by honeydew. And when the mosquito locates the ants who've been feeding on the honeydew, the mosquito strokes the ant's antennae and sticks their proboscis into the ant's mouth, inducing the ant to regurgitate honeydew. I think that's pretty bizarre. There are even predaceous mosquitoes, and some people call elephant mosquitoes the best mosquitoes because they don't bite us and their larvae feed on other mosquitoes. On the lower right, you can see a regular sized mosquito being eaten by this huge elephant mosquito larva. Mosquitoes come in all different shapes, sizes, and colors, and their host preferences vary widely too. Many species feed on birds and mammals, but there are some that feed on reptiles and even on fish or worms. And so there's all kinds of fascinating mating behaviors too. In the case of this one that's called the iridescent paddle mosquito, the male not only has incredible disco plumage on his legs, but he does a mating dance to attract females. There's even some species that show parental behavior. This hairy-lipped mosquito guards her eggs until they hatch. And all of this is in that Smithsonian article. So I recommend taking a look at it. So the ecological role of mosquitoes is critical for ecosystems around the globe. They're important food sources for other insects and animals at every point in their life cycle. They and other aquatic flies form the foundations of wetland food chains, and each species is different, and that's an important consideration that's often overlooked in mosquito control programs. So now we're going to shift to talking about mosquito control programs, which here in Colorado are mainly focused on reducing the risk of West Nile virus to people. So this is the West Nile virus page of the CDC. Now, almost all state and local governments and agencies look to the CDC for guidance on how to protect the public from mosquito-borne disease. The transmission of West Nile is much more complicated than this diagram, but people and horses can get West Nile virus from being bitten by an infected mosquito, and we're what's called a dead-end host, which means that West Nile transmission goes one way from mosquitoes to us, and we aren't a source of West Nile for mosquitoes, but mosquitoes can pick it up from birds. We're the main host. So once West Nile is high enough levels in birds and mosquito populations, the levels can build up or amplify, increasing the number of infected mosquitoes and the risk of transmission to people. Each species, whether it's a bird, a mammal, or mosquito, has different levels of vector competency or the ability for the virus to survive in the host in a way that can be transmitted. And all the players can also develop immunity to the virus. And of course, viruses mutate. So the cycle is complex. Now, it's important to remember that all mosquito species are not the same. This is really a general classification for our purposes of talking about West Nile virus management. And we look in roughly two categories. So vector mosquitoes are mosquitoes that can become infected with and transmit West Nile. And here we're focused on Culex species. Culex lay their eggs directly on water. Now, mosquitoes that bite people that aren't likely to transmit disease are called nuisance mosquitoes. And the majority of nuisance mosquitoes in our area are floodwater mosquitoes. And they lay their eggs on mud or on damp soil. And part of their life cycle requires their eggs to dry out, which you can see in these photos. Okay, did I? Okay, yeah, I skipped right past the life cycle. Okay, so mosquitoes are flies, and all flies go through a complete metamorphosis. So the life cycle on the left is for Culex mosquitoes that lay their eggs, and mosquitoes like them that lay their eggs directly in water. And on the right are what are called delayed hatching or floodwater mosquitoes. So floodwater mosquito eggs dry out and can build up over time in the soil. Sometimes, sort of like seed banks for weeds, sometimes for years. So once an area becomes inundated with water, the eggs reconstitute and hatch. And once they hatch, the larvae have to remain in the water to complete their life cycle. So if a site dries out at this point, it will kill them just like it would a Culex larva. But when there's a big rain event in the spring that saturates a large area, you can get a synchronous emergence of floodwater mosquitoes leading to huge population spikes. And they can be aggressive biters, and some species can travel for miles and miles beyond the site where they emerge. We often see both Culex and floodwater mosquitoes at the same sites. So the floodwater mosquitoes hatch, and then once there's water, the Culex females come along and lay their eggs on water. Now, of the 12 species of mosquitoes that we catch in our traps at the city, we usually see 2 species of culex, and the proportion of the different species can change over the season. So you'll see more floodwater mosquitoes early in the season, and the percentage of culex can start increasing as the season progresses. But not all culex are infected. But what if you are bitten by an infected mosquito? And what will happen to you? So most people who get West Nile, around 80%, have no symptoms and never even know that they'd had it. About 20% of people who get infected experience what's called West Nile fever, and they have flu-like symptoms ranging from mild to severe. But the reason we care so much about this disease is because the one out of 150 who are infected, around that number, who develop neuroinvasive disease and that can cause encephalitis or meningitis or a polio-like illness that's called flaccid paralysis. And these people become very ill. It can be fatal, and the people who survive often suffer from life-changing disabilities. So since people can get so sick if they get the neuroinvasive form of the disease, public health officials take West Nile very seriously. And unlike the flu or COVID, West Nile virus can be prevented by taking precautions to avoid being bitten by mosquitoes. But this is important. Everyone who gets West Nile, including the majority who aren't aware they've had it, become immune. So it may seem like lots of rain would mean more mosquitoes and therefore a higher risk for West Nile, but this study looked at West Nile and climatic data from several states to determine the drivers for human cases. And one of the states they analyzed in depth was Colorado. So when West Nile first arrived in 2003, we were one of the hardest hit states, and we still have some of the highest numbers. And this study found that drought and immunity were the main drivers for cases in Colorado. So drought increases the risk and human immunity decreases the risk. And drought may not seem to make sense because culex lay their eggs on water. But when it's droughty, it's thought that birds, which are the main host, and mosquitoes will be more concentrated around water sources, and that the odds of them coming into contact to spread West Nile then become higher. And Colorado is an outdoorsy state. And since West Nile is always present in the summer at some level, many of us have been exposed. So I want you to pay attention to the shape of this graph from this study. The first year is 0 on the x-axis when West Nile first arrived in Colorado, when nobody was immune. And there were almost 3,000 cases that year. But it dropped off in successive years. Now, this graph looks solely at neuroinvasive cases. That's why you see around 600 instead of 3,000 cases reported the first year. And what's interesting about this study is that they ran climate and epidemiological models for different types of future scenarios. And these symbols past the dotted line are future projections for human risk using climate models where M is a mean and E is for extreme climate conditions. And they predicted that although we'll continue to see cases, that they didn't expect that we'd ever have another epidemic. Now I'm going to shift to Boulder County for the rest of my talk. And this chart shows the number of human cases, both flu and neuroinvasive cases for all of Boulder County from 2003 to last year. And above each bar denotes the number of deaths that year. So if you remember what that graph looked like in the study, the pattern's similar. And the health departments rely on physicians to test people who show symptoms of West Nile and report those cases to the health departments, who then go and investigate and confirm whether it was a West Nile case. But since people who get flu-like version of West Nile may not seek medical care or their doctors may not recognize it, these cases are often likely to be undercounted. So the numbers that are much more accurate are the people who get neuroinvasive disease or those who die. And you can see during our worst year in 2003, we had 7 deaths in Boulder County. And we've had several years with no deaths, but the last few years, the deaths are almost as high as 2003. So here's West Nile virus cases for the whole state of Colorado. And when we look at the statewide numbers, we're starting to see human cases starting to rise again. And again, these are all forms of reported human West Nile cases. So those include the West Nile fever, which is more like the flu. But this is a graph that shows the number of deaths each year in Colorado, and this indicates much more how things are changing when we're looking at overall cases. So the last number of years have shown a significant increase in deaths. And last year we lost 50 people, which is getting close to 2003 levels. And from the model in the study, we should have stayed mostly in single digits. So what's happening and what is a model, is this model wrong or is something else going on? So the best method we have to estimate risk is by trapping adult mosquitoes. And these traps are set overnight. They have a light source and they have a carbon dioxide source, which attracts female mosquitoes looking for a blood meal. We take the captured mosquitoes and they're keyed to species and counted, and the culex are separated out from sentinel traps, and then those are tested for West Nile infection. The population of culex mosquitoes and the infection rate are used to calculate a value called the vector index. And 0.75 is the threshold that predicts that human cases are likely to occur. So we'll take a look at the vector index values throughout Boulder County for the last 3 years, which is the time frame when we started seeing human cases increase. So for the purposes of tracking West Nile risk, Boulder County is divided into 3 zones, with the Boulder County Public Health managing surveillance and testing, and a team of ecologists and our contractor for the city, Timberline Aquatics, who are aquatic entomologists. We submit samples directly to CSU for testing. So you have these 3 zones that are part of Boulder County, and then the City of Boulder, which is separate. And on the right, you can see how we map our larval or potential mosquito larval breeding sites. And the reason why you see so many is that the city has 45,000 acres of open space land and a ring around the city. And so many of these sites are on grasslands and agricultural fields or wetland sites. And field teams inspect these sites for mosquito larvae every week during the mosquito season. So Boulder County's Zone 1 is the closest to the City of Boulder, and the county inspects and treats mosquito larvae on their own properties, and they also trap mosquitoes for monitoring, and they spray neighborhoods and unincorporated areas outside of city limits. And Zone 2 is Longmont area, and Zone 3 is the eastern part of the county. Okay, so remember the vector index predictor of human cases is 0.75. So let's take a look at these index values starting in 2001. Mosquitoes are trapped and tested once a week, and the red bars are the vector index value for that week. The green box is a visual to show you where 0.75 is on the chart. So this is the unincorporated areas of Boulder County. And this is Longmont. And this is the eastern part of the county, so Erie, Superior, Lafayette, Louisville, that area. And here's the City of Boulder. So before 2021, it was unusual to see vector indexes this high in any given week. It's also concerning when you start seeing positive mosquito tests week after week, since it indicates that West Nile is building in mosquito populations. In fact, when I would look back at vector index data back through 2007, there were many years when the vector index never exceeded 0.75 for any zone. Except for one case in 2013 when it was over 1. So there's never been a value as high as 5, and this is new territory. So let's see what happened in 2022. So once again, we see multiple weeks with values exceeding 0.75, sometimes by quite a lot. And these 4 charts are all scaled to each other for comparison. The City of Boulder had no positive mosquito tests that whole season. In fact, in the history of our program, the city has only exceeded the 0.75 value threshold one time at one week in 2017 when it made it up to 0.8. So now let's go on to 2023, the year when West Nile deaths were close to 2003 levels. And here, for the last year, we see some of the highest vector index levels I've ever heard of or anyone else in the region. So to remember, the highest in 2022 was 3.52 and 2021 was 5.03, which felt crazy at that time. But then last year, here we have one over 16. So that was the West Nile infection. How did the mosquito numbers compare? So the city made some changes to our program in 2018. I'll show you in a minute. So I'm particularly interested from that point. And this chart shows how the average number of mosquitoes per trap from all of Boulder County. So this is all the cities and unincorporated areas of the county, and our city traps are also included in those because I don't have the data without it, compared to the city of Boulder. So this is for all mosquito species, so both nuisance and Culex species. And as you can see, the city traps are consistently lower. But here we look at Culex species, and we see a striking difference. And though Culex were higher last year for the city than the previous years, our average trap count from the rest of the county was, more than 5. The rest of the county was more than 5 times higher than the city's trap counts. So why is there this difference? And before I start talking about the differences between the city's approach and other cities and counties in Colorado, I just want to say this. I started working for this city 15 years ago, and part of my job has been managing our mosquito program. And I was hired back in 2009, which was just 6 years after the West Nile epidemic. And although we still saw human cases, 8 of the next 9 years, no one died in the whole county. But I was always afraid that we could have a West Nile really bad year. And I can't even begin to express how heavy that weight feels on your shoulders when you're responsible for running a program and worry that decisions you make can affect someone else. So I just want to make it clear that when the other cities creating their programs, they're following the guidance of the CDC, and they're doing what they feel is the very best they can do to protect the public. So I want to start by looking at what's the same in all of our programs. The city's program compared to CDC programs. We all set traps to monitor mosquitoes, adult mosquitoes, and test for West Nile virus. We all map and inspect larval breeding sites, and we all spend time educating the public about how to protect themselves. There's one difference in how the city impacts or inspects and treats our larval sites. The city has always kept data on the density of mosquito larvae at each of our over 500 map sites since we created our program. And it just so happens that skilled field technicians can tell the difference between Culex and other types of mosquito larvae. So mosquito larvae don't have gills, so they have to come up to the surface of the water to get air. And Culex, which are on the bottom right here, have this long angled siphon at the tip of their abdomen. It's like a snorkel. And this is an Aedes larva, a nuisance floodwater mosquito larva at the top, and they look and behave differently. So when checking for mosquito larvae, the techs use a cup on the end of a long stick, and they dip it into the water to look for mosquito larvae. And the skilled tech or ecologist can ID Culex larvae. And here's a close-up inside the cup with arrows pointing to the Culex. All this data is tracked, so the city has over 20 years of larval data for both Culex and non-Culex mosquito larvae. And the reason the city required Culex and non-Culex larvae to be ID'd in the field is because when the city's program was first created, only Culex were treated. So this is the Integrated Mosquito Management, or IMM slide. This slide is from the CDC website. So public education involvement and evaluating actions are important and something that we all do. But notice that IMM includes controlling nuisance mosquitoes. Nuisance mosquitoes don't carry disease, which is why the city's program initially focused on Culex. Other mosquito programs that follow CDC guidelines treat all life stages, which is what CDC says to do. Yet we're seeing more and more West Nile infected mosquitoes and higher mosquito numbers. And it's a pretty major assumption that control methods are safe or effective. First, mosquito populations continue to rise. One study showed by as much as 10-fold in the last 50 years. But for the rest of my talk, I want to explore the potential impacts from CDC recommended control methods on mosquito populations and non-target organisms and ecosystems. So what exactly does it mean to control mosquitoes at all life stages? The CDC recommends different pesticides for controlling mosquitoes. Their focus is on controlling or preventing mosquitoes at each point in their life cycle. So when we look at it on the life cycle, we see that there's an insecticide for every stage. Adulticides are broad-spectrum insecticides that are fogged from trucks or sprayed on vegetation. And adult mosquitoes are tiny, and they can dry out in the heat of summer, so we rest during the day in shady, cooler spots. And since different species have different preferences from where they like to hang out, some prefer trees or grasses or forbs, and all of this vegetation can be treated with chemicals like bifenthrin from backpack sprayers for what are called barrier treatments. The CDC also includes organophosphates in their recommendations, which are products like naled or malathion. Nope, it wasn't done yet. But the most common products used in the Front Range are these synthetic pyrethroids. Permethrin's used for fogging and bifenthrin for spraying vegetation. Both are toxic to aquatic and terrestrial invertebrates and associated with a whole suite of issues in people, including cognitive issues in kids and reproductive issues in adults. A few years ago, PFAS was detected in Anvil, one of the permethrin adulticide products, and it was thought that it probably leached from the plastic container. But at that point, people started looking into sources of PFAS, and it was revealed that PFAS chemicals had been added to different pesticides as adjuvants. And the EPA was allowing those PFAS additives in pesticide formulations in just a few years, until just recently, a few years ago, once it came to the public's attention. And most of these adjuvants are confidential business information, so we don't know what they are. But what people don't realize is that the active ingredient in many pesticides are actually PFAS themselves, including bifenthrin, that is commonly used in residential mosquito treatments and by some authorities for public programs. And I'm just pointing this out because I think it's important for people to know that, as a Scientific American article shows, during a 5-year period, 70% of new pesticide products of all different types, including herbicides, are fluorinated for forever chemicals. So many people aren't aware of this, and the chemical industry is lobbying to challenge and limit the definitions for PFAS, which are fluorinated chemicals, as states enact PFAS bans. Some states like Maine and Massachusetts are phasing out the use of PFAS pesticides, which is most of the new chemistries coming on the market. But that's a whole different topic for another day. So the question is, do these adult these sprays for adult mosquitoes even work? And this is an estimate from the late David Pimentel from Cornell, who estimated in this publication that is 0.00000.1% of adulticide droplets hit a mosquito from aerial applications. And mosquitoes not only can become resistant to insecticides, but they can even learn to avoid them after one sublethal exposure. This study is one of several that shows that insecticide exposure and resistance can increase the infection of pathogens in mosquitoes, in this case, increasing West Nile infection and Culex. And there are a couple of other, this is just a couple papers of multiple papers on ecological impacts that pyrethroids have on aquatic organisms, and there are many other in the literature about impacts to non-target organisms, which is expected from a broad spectrum insecticide. Surface soils are often used for later instar larvae and for pupae, and surface film products are non-selective. They're lethal to small surface breathing insects, including mayflies, aquatic beetles, and bugs, and they're also known to impact duck eggs. Insect growth regulators like methoprene, which is a synthetic analog of juvenile hormone, is also applied to water. And juvenile hormone is common to all insects. As insects grow and molt, juvenile hormone keeps them in an immature state. So keeping JH, or juvenile hormone, artificially constant blocks larvae from maturing, not just mosquitoes, but also non-target immature insects. And it also can prevent insect eggs from hatching. So what impact could this have on non-target invertebrates at treated sites? And what about larvicides? So many programs are using more and more bacterial larvicides, and environmental organizations also encourage larvicide use to avoid synthetic products. And there's a perception that natural products are safe, or at least safer than synthetic pesticides. But in my opinion, it's a big mistake to assume that natural products are benign. In fact, it can be just the opposite. So to recap, the approach the CDC recommends is really focused on killing mosquitoes at every life stage. And this may seem to make sense to our human brains that are wired to efficiently and quickly tackle a problem in a linear and reductionist way. But what it doesn't account for are the non-target impacts and cascading impacts to biodiversity and ecosystems. So what does the City of Boulder do? We have an ecological integrated pest management policy that takes the opposite approach. So instead of focusing on killing a target organism, The focus is on managing the ecosystem by promoting the stability of desirable species to discourage pests and promote the natural balances within it. So this means a lot of observation and monitoring, but it also means reviewing the literature, consulting with ecologists, and applying ecological principles when making management decisions. It takes patience, and it's ever evolving as we learn. So the city doesn't spray for adult mosquitoes, use insect growth regulators or surface soils. We do use one of the bacterial larvicides, BTI. The city's program evolved over the years, and initially larval breeding sites were only treated if Culex larvae were present, and not at all for nuisance species. But then in 2007, a small subset of sites were chosen for nuisance larval treatment. A threshold was used, and that's an algorithm. There's an algorithm for dipping with the cup on the stick around a site to determine how many times you should dip and what area, depending on the area you're covering and the type of habitat. And there was by averaging all those dips together and having one larva per dip, that was a threshold for nuisance treatment in those days. But in 2018, we did more of a substantial update. I mean, we had our city wetland ecologists categorize larval sites as high or low quality. And we went over 20 years of data from every site visit to categorize sites by mosquito breeding activity. And we also used these categories to make management decisions. So the whole idea was to learn more about the characteristics of breeding sites. And we developed a complex treatment threshold that takes biodiversity and presence of mosquito predators into account. I did an in-depth literature search at the time to learn as much as possible about the ecology of mosquitoes and other critters associated with these sites. And there were a lot of papers, new papers about BTI at that point, and there are even more now. And what we learned made it even more clear that we needed to reduce BTI use as much as possible. So this view is more of the mosquito life cycle is more in alignment with what the city's trying to achieve. In functioning ecosystems, there are predators at every life stage. And the questions we ask ourselves are, what are the characteristics that from these sites where predators thrive, and how do we increase biodiversity, not only of predators, but of different mosquito species and other aquatic fly larvae present at these sites? And how can we manage our land and wetlands to encourage as much biodiversity as possible? And what impact do management actions have on desired species and the ecosystem as a whole? So when we updated our program in 2018, the field team conducted biodiversity surveys during every single larval site visit. So there are hundreds over the season. And this is when the field ecologist conducting an aquatic biodiversity survey with an aquatic net. So the contents from the net are dumped into a white enamel pan. And here you can see all the variety of aquatic insects. There are different species of damselfly nymphs and different types of bugs and beetles and a whole variety of different taxa. And at sites that look like this, we don't find many mosquito larvae. And when we do find mosquito larvae, the team takes into account the abundance and variety of predator taxa and the age of the mosquito larvae before making a decision to treat with BTI. And if they're unsure that there are enough predators to keep Culex larvae from taking off, they come back a day or two later to check to see what's happening before treating. We track amphibians, fish, and other vertebrates. And this is an important determinant for BTI treatment. We don't treat when tadpoles are present, and I'll explain more in just a minute. We also track terrestrial biodiversity at these sites. The team sweep nets, and they also note birds, frogs, and insects. And since our team are great aquatic entomologists, they know their insects and have seen some new records for species of dragonflies. They're always seeing something interesting and new. So we continue to inspect each site with mosquito depths using the standard mosquito industry protocols for consistency with our historic data. But here, during a routine larval inspection, you can see there's so much diversity at these sites that she picked up a bunch of dragonfly nymphs. And we try to keep BTI to a real minimum. One of the areas, often the areas that are colonized by mosquitoes before predators arrive are depressions that fill with water on the margins of a higher quality wetland area. So the team does what they can to reduce those numbers, and they've even been known just to scoop out the mosquito larvae. And when they do treat, they try to target really carefully to keep BTI use minimal. And here you can see a field team member hand applying a small amount. So why are we working so hard to minimize BTI, and what does it have to do with biodiversity? So here's a simple food pyramid for a wetland food web with plants, plankton, and algae, the organisms that photosynthesize are at the base of ecosystems. And when it's all in balance, we end up with shifts. When it's not in balance, I mean, we can end up with shifts in that can impact water chemistry and even lead to algal blooms. BTI kills mosquitoes, but it also kills midges and other aquatic fly larvae. And when they're pulled out of the system, it can create shifts at the base level. And of course, the lack of food impacts predators who feed on mosquitoes and flies, which then cascades up the food chain. At each trophic level, there's competition for resources. And this is particularly important for these primary consumers, where there can be different species of mosquitoes, some that carry disease and some don't, and dozens of different species of non-biting midges and other types of aquatic flies. There are tadpoles of different frog species, and depending on the species, each of these can feed, these flies or frogs can feed on algae or microorganisms or organic matter from plant decomposition. So there are lots of factors in how they all interact. And the further down the pyramid the changes occur, the more it can affect the entire system. And then, of course, there are predators, these in complex interactions within these food webs. So not only does having the entire system in balance allow competition of Culex larvae and the adult Culex that emerge, but it also, these wetland ecosystems are, when they're in balance, the predators keep the mosquito populations lower and allow a mix of, oops, wait, my finger got ahead of itself, of species of mosquitoes. So if we focus on the primary consumer level of the pyramid, and here I'm using colors to represent different species of mosquitoes, both Culex and floodwater, and different species of midge larvae and a couple species of tadpoles. And of these, we have some mosquitoes, but we have all these other creatures. Aquatic flies are the foundations of wetland ecosystems in both their larval or immature stages and when they emerge as adults. So they're food for predatory insects, birds, fish, and mammals. And when you have a thriving ecosystem, you have fewer Culex in it. And by applying BTI, we risk killing or decreasing populations of Culex competitors. And this is because BTI kills not only mosquitoes, but also aquatic flies. And even more concerning, BTI kills tadpoles. There are 2 studies showing the toxicity of BTI to tadpoles. BTI produces a toxic protein crystal, and when it's ingested by insects, it tears up their guts, and it's how it kills them. And this is a figure from one of the studies, tadpole studies, showing what BTI does at field rates to tadpole guts. The photo on the left is a normal gut, and the photo on the right shows the effects of BTI. BTI harms chiromidids and other invertebrate communities, so repeated applications can have long-term consequences to the base of wetland ecosystems. And these are direct impacts, but what about indirect impacts? What happens when you remove or substantially reduce this whole level of the food chain? And as you would guess, pulling out animals that feed on phytoplankton changes and affects the composition of these plant communities. And studies show that the cascading trophic impacts you'd expect by reducing dragonflies and damselflies who feed on mosquitoes and midges, the birds that feed on dragonflies and damselflies are impacted. We lost nearly 3 billion birds in North America in the last 30 years, so we really need to take these types of impacts seriously. BTI is a living organism. It reproduces. It gets moved on animal bodies or in their feces to new locations, and it's persistent. And disease-carrying mosquitoes also adapt to our attempts to control them. So there's evidence that Culex and the yellow fever mosquito, Aedes aegypti, are developing resistance to BTI. As we modify wetlands with mosquito control practices over time, could we actually be pushing it more towards habitat that favors Culex? And there's just so much we don't know, including the ecology of BTI. This is a paper I just came across recently that's totally new to me. You can even agree on the basic ecology or biology of BTI strains, and which animals they affect or how. And some other factors to consider. I shared just a fraction of the literature and potential impacts on BTI, but what about the other products that are used in mosquito management? And what are the impacts from other types of land management? For example, herbicides that are used on or near wetlands can affect algae and phytoplankton and shift their composition. Decomposition from dead plants alone also changes the composition of mosquitoes and other wetland organisms. And there are studies showing how different herbicides can affect the growth of mosquitoes, and even some showing how it can affect their ability to become infected with a pathogen. And last year was a very wet year that probably resulted in much more herbicide use than normal. So could this be another factor in why we're seeing so much more West Nile virus? So this chart shows the number of larval sites that the city's program treated last season, which you can see almost all are in the single digits. We rarely treat more than 10 or so, or 12 or so. But what I think is really interesting is how these sites are either a mix of Culex and nuisance or just nuisance. Only one site last year had Culex present alone. So here's all the charts we saw earlier for vector index on one page, scaled to each other. So you can have a direct comparison across years and across jurisdictions. And these ecological processes are complex, and this is just a snapshot of 3 years. It's a comparison of CDC-based programs to the city's ecosystem management approach. So coming back to the title of the webinar, do mosquito programs make you safer? But what does seem to make us safer is biodiversity. And there are more and more papers being published about the role of biodiversity in animal and insect-borne disease. This one looked at multiple viruses and several mosquito species across a gradient of habitat quality. And their conclusion was that host species composition is critical for virus abundance. Environmental changes that lead to an uneven host community composition and to more individuals of a single species are key drivers for virus emergence. So how we approach management is driving biodiversity. So a product approach versus a more complex understanding on ecosystem management. And we're seeing massive losses in vertebrates. And we're also seeing precipitous declines in insects. This diagram is from a paper by David Wagner about insect declines showing the many ways that land management is harming insects. Industrial agriculture is a #1 cause of biodiversity loss worldwide. And it comes down to how we use land and how we manage it, and how we manage land. Mosquitoes can easily adapt and thrive in all these environments, and other insects, including their predators and birds, can't. So with climate change, we have winners and we have losers, and mosquitoes are currently winners. So instead of focusing on killing them, which is a zero-sum game, that they're winning, the answer, in my opinion, is to manage ecosystems, restore degraded areas, and use land management practices that conserve insects. And this beautiful diagram that was created by local artist Faith Williams for the Xerces Society during the Colorado insect pollinating study shows the answers to reversing insect decline by managing ecosystems to conserve biodiversity. And by doing that, we not only save insects, the foundations of the world's ecosystems, but we save ourselves. So we need as many insects as possible to be winners during this time of rapid change. And we need for mosquitoes to be just one part of thriving ecosystems. And it's not too late. And more people everywhere are managing land in partnership with nature. So I'm going to close with this video that I love from one of the ecologists monitoring for mosquitoes, surrounded by a cloud of dragonflies. Oops.
All of those are dragonflies. Aren't they beautiful?
So thank you for joining me today to talk about mosquitoes.
Wow, Rella, thank you so much. That was amazing and so informative. And I think we all learned a lot. So thank you again just for joining us and teaching us, and we really appreciate it. It looks like we do have some time for a few questions. So I'll go ahead and get started with those. We have a beekeeper in the crowd who has colonies in their backyard. And how effective is being on the no spray list in saving the bees?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember how the no spray list works. And if I remember correctly, it's an opt-in list for both beekeepers and for agricultural operations. And so, I mean, I think any information is better than no information. And if there's, and as long as people are following the label, they can apply whatever they'd like. So that's it's one thing, but I think it's pretty limited in protecting honeybees or other insects.
Got it. Thank you. And we will send out that no spray list sign up in our follow-up, just in case folks do want to get on it. The next,
Oh, sorry, sorry, Anna Gray. I was confused. Were they referring for the bee drift hop thing, or the fogging, the insect and the mosquito fogging no
oh,
spray
the
list?
fogger
Sorry.
no spray list.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood that.
No, that was my bad. You're good.
Yeah, I mean, there's different studies showing the impact from these micro droplets of these ultra low volume sprays to insects of different sizes. They tend to be much more harmful to smaller bodied insects. I think what could really be harmful are these barrier treatments, the bifenthrin sprays that are sprayed on vegetation. You know, the whole idea behind those is that they come out and spray every 2 weeks from spring till fall. And these are what the Summer Without Mosquitoes campaigns you hear from True Green and other companies, Mosquito Joe. And the whole idea is that they're persistent enough and toxic enough that if an insect lands on it, if a mosquito lands on a treated plant, that it kills them for that 2 weeks until they come and reapply it. And I think those are probably pretty impactful to bee colonies and all other insects.
Got it. Thank you so much. The next question is, how many species of mosquitoes live in North America, and what stops the malaria mosquito from living in North America?
Well, what was it? We have about 200 species. Is that right? I'm trying to remember now. I think we have about 200 species in the US anyway. And we don't, as far as I know, we don't have Aedes aegypti here yet, but I mean, we may start having them in the South, and we have had malaria actually in the US before. I'm not a malaria expert, but I know that I've read that we have had malaria in some of the more southern states, I believe, but I don't think it's it's not a big issue here yet anyway.
Got
And it
it.
has a lot to do with just the range of the mosquito species that carry the disease.
Great. Thank you. Our next question is, how was the vector index threshold of 0.75 determined as being the point at which humans are likely to be infected?
Yeah, this is actually a really funny question, or not fun, but funny to me. It's not like funny, haha, but funny, interesting, because most people, including the entire mosquito industry, don't know how the vector index came into being. And the city hired a firm, this isn't the firm we use now, Timberline, but a different company that now is out of business. The founder retired, called Ottertail Environmental, instead of hiring a mosquito contractor back in the early days in the early 2000s. And so when they were developing our mosquito program, after the 2003 outbreak of West Nile virus, Ed Fleming, the owner of Ottertail, sat down and looked at all the information we had from Boulder in 2003. So he looked at he said, what information do we have? We know how many culex we had. We know the number, we know the human cases, and we know the infection rate of the culex. And so he graphed it all, and he looked at, like, when you reach this point of infection and populations or abundance of culex mosquitoes, that you start seeing a correlation with human cases. And he went back and he just arbitrarily called it 0.75. And that's how the vector index started. And that was later adopted by CDC and others. But, you know, there are more complex types of estimates, but that one's you know, is pretty predictable. When you start seeing that level of infection and Culex numbers, you start seeing people getting sick because there's enough of it around that people are going to be more exposed.
Right. That's super interesting. Our next question is, what kind of staffing is required to execute Boulder's whole system approach? And how did Boulder start investing in this approach? Were there lots of hurdles for getting the resources needed?
Yeah, so the way that the program began initially was pretty, you know, it's pretty intensive to go out and check all these sites each week. But that's what the other programs should be doing anyway. They should be dipping before they treat to see if there are even mosquitoes present. So that Ed, the same guy who came up with the vector index, was like, yeah, we can tell the difference between Culex and non-Culex. And so let's just treat Culex. Our open space folks were concerned about putting BTI down. And there were a few studies then, but it was just common sense that if you're starting to take out aquatic flies, you're going to have impacts on your wetland ecosystems. So our program, I think, you know, for all these years has been comparable to other programs that have trapping, testing, and also adult trapping and map their larval sites and inspect them and treat them with larvicide. You know, we don't use a whole bunch of other products they use. We don't spray, which is expensive too. But a few years ago, when we did this transition to this new program that includes all these biodiversity surveys, the cost didn't go up. When we, after Ottertail, Ed retired, and we had to use a mosquito contractor for a couple of years because they sold the company, the mosquito portion of his company, to them. But we were really lucky that Dave Reese, who owns Timberline Aquatics, is one of the best aquatic entomologists in the entire region. And he was willing to take this on. So, I mean, it is a tremendous amount of work, and they do this, his team, who are all ecologists, you know, like one of them is one of the few people in the whole country that of 20, I think, that can identify stoneflies, is certified. This is a level of expertise they have. And they really care about this. They're really interested in the kinds of patterns we're seeing and how biodiversity is important in these wetland sites. So the short answer is that I don't know how other cities can find someone like that who are capable of doing that level of work. But I think it's important, and at least the first place we can start is requiring mosquito companies to at least show the density of larvae that are in the sites. No, I don't think anyone's tracking that information besides us. And we don't know if these sites last year were mostly Culex. We saw adult traps that would have huge numbers of Culex in other jurisdictions. So we just have a glut of information.
Got it. Thank you so much. It is 1 o'clock. We have a few more questions. Are you able to stay on a few minutes longer? Or otherwise I can
Sure.
just email you the questions. Okay, sure. Great. Thank you. So if you know, what does the CDC think about your success and concepts?
I don't think the CDC knows about it. And as you can imagine, it's a little, it feels a little weird coming out where you have to compare your results to others, but that's the only way that, you know, we know what it means, you know, to look at what others, what types of numbers other people are experiencing. And I would love to see a researcher come and do an analysis of whatever data we've got along the entire Front Range, to see, you know, why we're having these unexpected differences from that one really thorough study that, you know, expected us to stay pretty stable. And there's, you know, lots of different factors. You know, agriculture is thought to be one of the big reasons why we're seeing mosquito increases in populations, and also why we're seeing decreases in things like dragonflies and birds. And so there's like, it's super complicated, and we don't have enough data to really say what's happening. we're not a research institute, we're a city. So we gather the data we can, but it's not our place to do research in other jurisdictions either. So I really hope that we can garner some interest in our program, just because of the data that we have, the long-standing data set that might be of interest.
Yeah, that would be so cool. The next question is, how can the average gardener incorporate diverse predators to reduce mosquitoes?
Yeah, so, well, the things that are important are the educational information all the jurisdictions use, which is to get rid of standing water in your yard. Okay, so the mosquitoes that breed in people's yards are usually Culex pipiens. It's called the house mosquito for a reason. And those guys don't travel very far from where they emerge. And you can generate a lot of them, in a little, in gutters, that aren't draining, in a garbage can top, if you have that standing water there. And when it's really hot, those guys can zip through in about a week, from laying an egg to hatching out as an adult, emerging as an adult. So that's one thing, is just to do whatever you can to keep Culex down. These floodwater mosquitoes are just going to come in. Okay, they fly sometimes 25 miles or more. So I mean, it's always great to have diversity and have birds and everything you can in your yard. That's important for all kinds of reasons. But there's stuff that really is outside of our hands as far as these floodwater mosquitoes. And it doesn't matter what you do. As far as like these mosquito programs are spraying your yard, which, is really bad for your health and for pollinators and everyone else. Just use mosquito repellents if you can afford it. Put a screen porch on your house. But another thing that works great is just to have fans blowing. If you have a couple fans on your deck blowing, especially, the more turbulent you can get it, that's how mosquitoes find us. They track our odors, and they have to have still air to be able to do that. And they also can't fly, because they're tiny if the wind's moving too fast. So that's one thing you can do. But overall, we just need more biodiversity and protection of wetlands, and just protecting our natural areas, so that those are the places where we have massive potential for control of mosquitoes. If you have tons and tons of predators, there's no way we can replicate what a bunch of dragonflies and water boatmen and dyticids and all those insects and birds and fish can do. That's our best bet, to keep these numbers lower.
Got it. Thank you. Another question is, on a residential scale, if we're restoring wetlands, streams, ponds, would it make sense to introduce a water sample from a healthy wetland ecosystem to increase aquatic biodiversity? And how would someone identify a high quality wetland to sample from?
So I'm not quite sure I understand that. Does that mean?
Yeah, I think they're asking if they're restoring a wetland in their area, would it make sense to introduce water from a healthier wetland ecosystem?
I don't think so. What's going to happen is once you have a wetland established, and newer ones, can take time to get the whole complement of critters that you want there. But they will find it and colonize. Some of these notonectids, we know that they fly, as they're flying over, that they are attracted to reflective surfaces. That's how they find water. If you put the plants that attract insects and birds, and you have the right types of foundational elements that are going to attract the right insects, they'll come. I know that people have looked at releasing dragonflies in different places, to try to up the number of predators. But it's really a whole complex ecosystem. You can't really, mess around with one piece or another. You need the whole thing to be as healthy as possible. And wetland restoration is a whole huge, complicated thing to do. Yeah, I mean, and there are studies, in that too. If they're not balanced correctly, you can end up like breeding mosquitoes, which is what we don't want. But in a really highly functioning wetland, you won't see hardly any mosquitoes. In fact, you'll have like massive amounts of predators, and people also get mixed up with the non-biting midges. They'll see swarms of them and they always think it's mosquitoes, and they can be annoying, but they don't bite us, and they're very important, so that you want to see things like that.
Got it. And I just want to be respectful of your time. We have 3 questions left. Is that okay?
Sure.
Great, thank you. So we kind of touched on this already, but how can other cities be influenced to change their approach? And how can we reduce the number of private property owners who are hiring mosquito elimination companies?
Yeah, for the first one, you know, I've been our team has been talking with a disease ecologist from the Carey Institute that works on mosquito wet mosquito ecology and what is particularly West Nile and Culex. And we were asking her that question, you know, after people have been treating for years and years and years and years, if you just stopped, what happens? You know, okay, what's going to take to restore these sites? And it's a big question. She said, you know, once you end up in this kind of situation where you don't have these higher quality wetlands, you know, then how do you get off of using these products? And I don't really know the answer to that. And I think that the first thing we can do is just start gathering data, because we don't really know what the state is of most of these sites that are being treated. And there's a big difference between like an artificial site, you know, that's poor quality and isn't going to have any biodiversity, and sites that have the potential to have a much broader assemblage of organisms at them. So it isn't a really simple cut and dry thing. But I think we can at least start by asking mosquito contractors to show, you know, what they're actually treating. You know, when they're out there dipping, can they at least keep track, even if they don't want to tell the difference between Culex and nuisance, which I think is really valuable data. But they can at least track and see what the density is of these sites, because we don't know any, you know, we don't have any of that information, much less, you know, some of the biodiversity data that's really needed. So I think just starting to get some of that baseline data could be really helpful. And then thinking about ways, you know, to implement more and more ecosystem management principles, and that for other types of management too, because these other programs we have are definitely affecting mosquito predators and creating more favorable habitat for species like Culex. Culex can live in really highly polluted, polluted with organic material and kind of stinky areas that nothing else can live in. So what we don't want to do is push things more towards habitat for them, and really think about what we can do just to have higher quality habitat in general, that it can support more species of flies, as well as the predators and and tadpoles and other animals.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, if you treat your clothing with permethrin, what is its effect on a non-mosquito insect when it lands on it?
Well, I wouldn't be so concerned about other insects on my clothing. You know, it's our environment that matters. I'd be concerned about myself and putting a synthetic pyrethroid, which is what permethrin is, against my skin. And, you know, don't take my word for it. Go check the literature and see what the impacts are of synthetic pyrethroids on people's health. I know that that's something that's recommended, but it's not something I would ever recommend to anyone, especially children who are really susceptible to these. If you look at our urine, almost all of us have metabolites of pyrethroids in our urine because of the high levels of exposures. We get them from all different sources. And in some of the poorest communities who live in public housing and areas like that, farm workers will see like even higher levels. And we know that pyrethroids have significant health impacts. That's established. So I personally think that's a really bad idea to have it on your skin.
Got it. Thank you. All right, I think that covers everything. Thank you so much, Rella. We really appreciate you being here and learning from you. And yeah, this was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for joining.